Welcome, everyone, to the Center for Global Development virtual version. I'm Amanda Glassman. I'm the Executive Vice President and a Senior Fellow here at the Center. We're pleased to welcome you to today's event with a great group of speakers who will all be weighing in on recent advances in the methods and data available for faster, lower cost impact evaluation, and how we might leverage this new set of options for greater policy impact. As the COVID-19 pandemic persists, public budgets are increasingly under pressure, huge number of competing priorities, and so the need for high quality, timely evidence on the effectiveness of public programs and policies couldn't be clearer. And given that impact evaluations are uniquely suited to estimating the impact of programs and policies on desired outcomes, they play a really important role within the evidence and data ecosystem. One tool of many, but a hugely important one to be able to make attribution, really, to understand whether our new efforts or our particular programs are making a difference on the outcomes that we care about. But there's still a lot of challenges that limit the use of evaluation and evaluation findings by policymakers at both the global and the national levels, and this is true in all countries throughout the world. And it leaves social and economic gains on the table. Just as an example, the World Development Report of 2021 noted that the innovations resulting from creative new uses of data could prove to be one of the most life-changing events of the era. And new methods, these kinds of real-time methods are very widely used in the private sector, things like A/B testing, and yet in the public sector, still not generating evidence and using it as much as we could in real time. So in response to these challenges and building on progress to date, the Center for Global Development recently launched a working group that I lead together with Ruth Levine, who's a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development and the CEO of ID Insight. And with this group, we're considering how the next generation of investments in impact evaluations can enhance their usefulness, responsiveness, their real-timeness, and the relevance for public policy making. And we'll post the results of our deliberations throughout the next year or so. But to inform our conversations within the working group and the development of recommendations, we commissioned background work by Ann-Sofie Isaksson on evaluation techniques and new sources of data that can generate faster, lower cost studies as a guide to policymakers, funders, other stakeholders, and we're highlighting opportunities to put them in practice. So we'll kick off today's event with the initial presentation from Ann-Sofie, who's a researcher at the University of Gothenburg and the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Sweden. And then we'll hear some reactions and reflections from our other three speakers, two of whom are members of our working group. The first is Dr. Ariel Ben-Yeshai. He's the chief economist at Aid Data, an associate professor of economics at the College of William and Mary. He'll be followed by Kelly Bidwell, who's the director of the Office of Evaluation Sciences in the U.S. General Services Administration. I hope that she'll also describe to us what her office does and how it relates to the rest of government, because it's really exciting the way this office works and implements the Evidence Act that was recently passed in the U.S. Congress. And finally, we'll have Dr. Santosh Mathew, who's the country lead for public policy and finance at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's India country office. But prior to that, he was a very senior permanent secretary, joint secretary in the Indian Administrative Services, where he really is the embodiment of the kind of policymaker we'd all like to be. He both has thought through the key questions for determining how programs and policies should work, how to use evidence, data, and evaluation, impact evaluation, to inform the improvement of these programs over time. So it's a great panel. So let me, just one housekeeping item. You can submit questions by commenting on YouTube. You can tweet at us with the hashtag CGD Talks, or you can email us at events@cgdev.org. So we'll look forward to your interaction as we proceed through the event. Let me pass it now over to Ann-Sofie. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to start sharing my screen, see if that works. Okay then. So Amanda already made the introduction. Thank you for that. So I'm going to present the background work on rapid rigorous evaluation. So basically, the background to this paper, Amanda already introduced, but it's the idea that in order for impact evaluation to live up to its potential in terms of policy impact, there is a need to take into account the constraints in terms of time, budget, operational constraints of the concerned policymakers, and that this may necessitate faster, cheaper, and perhaps simpler studies. But we want to do so while maintaining an acceptable level of analytical rigor. So there's a trade-off involved here. So basically, the paper explores then the menu of experimental and quasi-experimental impact evaluation strategies open to evaluators, depending on context and evaluation specific constraints. And we seek to highlight some recent advances in the methods and data available for this purpose. So the paper discusses a variety of methodological developments, what characterizes these, when they are suitable to use, the data requirements involved, and also bring up a bunch of empirical examples of studies utilizing these specific techniques. So I will just be able to very much scratch the surface here in this 10-minute presentation, but we consider, for instance, the necessity of perhaps using context-specific smaller scale impact evaluations that are driven by implementer demands and tailored to implementer needs rather than to researcher needs, perhaps. So basically to test interventions under conditions that are very similar to those under which the intervention is intended to be scaled. We also discuss oops, sorry about that. The use of multiple treatment arms in impact evaluation as a way to be able to rapidly assess variations in program design, and also as a way to use multiple treatment arms but no pure control group in order to alleviate ethical concerns regarding withholding assistance for the control group. Another promising approach that we consider is the use of adaptive or iterative evaluation, where multiple waves of data is collected throughout the implementation process rather than presenting the findings say a couple of years after the intervention is completed. You present your findings and collect data throughout in order to be able to have real-time policy responses and a rapid feedback loop. Finally, we discuss some quasi-experimental econometric techniques that are well established, and also some newer developments that can be used in cases where randomization is not possible or desirable for some reason. So in terms of data developments, the paper discusses the increased availability of geocoded survey data, which makes it possible to geographically match survey respondents to specific program areas, and thus use survey data to assess potentially then both baseline or pre-intervention performance and post-intervention performance on relevant outcome variables. We also discuss the potential and challenges with using administrative data. So data that is collected for operational purposes rather than for the purpose of the actual impact evaluation. So it could be dealing with labor statistics or educational records and so on. We discuss the use of remotely sensed data, such as satellite imagery, that has increasingly been used to get a picture of local economic performance in areas where reliable such statistics is missing. And it's been used to look at, local economic conditions, migration, settlement, and land use patterns, and so on. And finally, we also discussed the surge in big data due to the increased use of digital technologies such as mobile phones, social media, internet, GPS devices, and so on. So there's a lot to cover in few pages and in 10 minutes. Okay, so a number of key points stand out from the discussion in the paper. With relevant for different target audiences, for those conducting the actual evaluation, for those implementing the policy that we seek to evaluate, and for those and for funders, basically. The first and perhaps obvious is the need to assess the right fit evaluation solution. So adjust the evaluation approach to fit the evaluation objectives and constraints of the concerned policymaker at hand. So there's no one size fits all solution, but what approach is most appropriate depends on the specific constraints involved. As I mentioned, there may be reason to use context-specific smaller scale impact evaluations that are designed to inform the specific policy decision of a specific implementer rather than to produce perhaps generalizable knowledge. I think a key takeaway is the potential in using readily available data materials, such as administrative data, remotely sensed data, georeferenced survey materials, and so on. And also to, when randomization is not feasible or desirable, to utilize quasi-experimental methods. So with this increased availability of detailed spatial data that is often available over long time periods, researchers are now better able to assess outcomes and control for confounding factors at very fine geographic levels, and often using very large samples as well. Okay, so another useful approach that comes out of the analysis is the use of iterative and adaptive evaluation. So as I mentioned, rather than presenting the findings of an impact evaluation, say a couple of years after it's been completed, then learn from the program along the way, so to speak. So observe outcomes in multiple waves and share findings in a phased-in approach in order to enable program adaptation and inform real-time policy decisions throughout the way. And this point, I think, has to do with the capacity constraints and way to deal with these. Working in interdisciplinary evaluation teams that include both evaluators with a social science background and evaluators with a more technical background, perhaps computer science expertise and so on, will potentially help to better tap the potential in these technological advances that we've been discussing, both on the data side and on the methodological side. And finally, a main takeaway, I think, is the need to build a data infrastructure to harness the potential in this new data ecosystem and make the data usable and accessible to implementers. This is an area that I think could benefit from donor financing and create an infrastructure and systems that actually help link different types of data and so on. So thank you. That's all for me at this point.
Thank you, Ann-Sofie. And I really encourage people to go to her paper, which is linked at the event site. And we're also trying to drop it into the YouTube blurb, because Ann-Sofie has specific examples of published evaluation findings that embody some of these approaches and the uses of these data. And with that, I think it's a good moment to turn to Ariel, because he has used a lot of some of the techniques and data sources that we've talked about, in particular geolocated data, to produce some really innovative evaluations of some aid financed programs, which is not always the case. So let me turn to you, Ariel.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks, Ann-Sofie, for what is a really interesting paper. I really love the kind of synthesis that happens when you compare and contrast all of these different data sets and approaches. I was particularly struck as you kind of listed out these options that, we often think about the right fit for them, but in many cases, multiple approaches might actually sync up pretty well. One big thing that we've really appreciated over the last few years is that a lot of the existing data that you described is now available for retrospective evaluations. So even before you launch a new program, you can go back and say, are there people who have done very similar things in similar settings that I can study? And the ability to then join that with, again, pre-existing outcome data and in a matter of a few months to maybe half a year at most, kind of do a rigorous study of where something similar has already been done. That then lets you do the kind of rapid evaluation that you described for your project or for whatever policy you're considering. So I really kind of it really sits at the intersection also of kind of disciplines and methodological choices. There have been big swings in evaluation, right, between randomization and quasi-experimental and all sorts of process and programmatic evaluation options. I feel like right now we're at a point where there is more room for collaboration across those methods than ever before, for many of these reasons. And I think while many of us may have played kind of the purists in a kind of role playing that we might have done over the past, now, given these methods are really kind of powerful in their own rights, I feel like they are, we're now much more collaborative and multidisciplinary, even within our disciplines, which is, I think, great. I also just really want to echo your last 2 points about this kind of multidisciplinarity and the investment and data, because certainly one thing we've appreciated, and I personally have appreciated, I'm a trained economist, but I work increasingly with, geographers, remote sensing specialists, computer scientists, et cetera, is that, we each bring our own backgrounds to this and have our own goals, and both, as academics, but also as kind of policy goals when we come to this. And that's not a trivial thing to solve, making sure that everyone is getting out of it what they need for their fields and disciplines. Takes a really kind of deep and long engagement. And so creating the space for those engagements where they're not kind of transactional, but they're, kind of, as I said, long and deep, I think is also important. And then finally, the goal is really that you don't need a PhD in any of the fields that I mentioned to be able to do this evaluation, right? And so bringing down the barriers to using these new data sources, whether they're geo-referenced, so you don't need a PhD in GIS, or you don't need a PhD in computer science or economics to do these, I think is a major public good. Certainly something we're striving for here, but I think much more generally, making these data much more easily downloadable, manipulatable, analyzable, and joinable across them is really essential. And in some cases that means building new tools, but in other cases that just means better harnessing, whether it's cloud-based computing or other, parallel processing that already, capacity that already exists. All of that we really have to kind of put to good use. So I'll stop there and happily, chat some more.
Thanks, Ariel. And maybe I could ask you for just a follow-up on your last point. Can you give an example of the kinds of funding that you've seen or that you've been part of that facilitated the investments in this kind of data infrastructure and multi-sectoral collaboration?
Yeah, for sure. We have been really lucky to get support from USAID, the Hewlett Foundation, the Cloudera Foundation, and a number of other sources to help us build a tool that we call GeoQuery. It's on our website, it's freely accessible. And it tries to take all the data that we've already produced, the georeferenced survey and aid data that we've produced here at Aid Data, and join it with all the many outcome measures that, that are already publicly accessible, whether they're from satellites or pre-existing surveys, and do that for people, again, without the need for a deep understanding of GIS. So if you want to know in Nigeria, for every state of Nigeria, what is child stunting rates and what are investments in the health sector by various donors over a given time window, again, the goal is that you shouldn't need to separately get all that data, manipulate it into a GIS, and then extract it back out. This system will do it for you, and then just give you a table that you can open in Excel or any statistical programming software. So that's one example that we've been pursuing. It's again a public good, and we've been really lucky that these funders are interested in this kind of public good, unlocking this, and it's useful again partly for policymakers, so analysts at government agencies, multilateral agencies, certainly partners in the developing world, but also for researchers who are focusing on their research questions and don't want to develop, again, like deep expertise in these methods particularly.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks, Ariel. Let's turn now to Kelly. You've been thinking about these issues for a long time in the context of the Evidence Act and in your role as the head of the Office of Evaluation Scientists at the U.S. General Services Administration. So I guess I'd invite you to reflect on the paper, but also what have you learned throughout the past couple of years in this space?
Sure. Thanks for having me and the opportunity. And Ann-Sofie, it was such a pleasure to read this paper. It's clear and well written, and was just something that resonated in many ways and really inspired me about the future directions for the field and this work. So just thank you. I was really excited about a number of parts, so it's going to be hard to keep it to a few minutes, but I'll try to cover some of the things that had the most underlines and exclamation points next to it. So one general comment is I'm just excited that this is pushing the conversation towards learning and being innovative and creative about learning in a lot of different ways. I hope that this pushes against conversations which I was a part of a lot in the past that said, well, if we don't have 6 years and $6 million, we can't learn. And this pushes us to think creatively and innovatively about short time frames and long time frames, about creative methods, about mixed methods. And as Ariel mentioned, really kind of combining this really impressive array of methods and ideas and options to make sure that we're being responsive to policymakers' needs and that we're giving them rigorous and rapid evidence at the time that they need it and answering the questions that they provide. So really eager to see where this heads and hope this spurs the field in exciting new directions. One piece in particular that's challenging, but I think exciting, is it emphasizes the potential for using administrative data more in the field. Obviously, that's something in the US context we benefit from more, perhaps less than you would think, but certainly more. And it's a huge asset in our work in the US government. It provides incredible opportunity for rapidly designing evaluations, implementing evaluations and learning, and having results in a more timely and policy relevant time frame. So it's not an easy challenge to invest in, build, and create useful and complex administrative data systems that can be a backbone for learning and evaluation, but it just offers such incredible potential in the years ahead. So glad that that's on this list, and glad that that's something that we can think as a broad community about how to use and invest in. I was also excited to see in particular, and this connects to our work at the Office of Evaluation Sciences, an emphasis on impact evaluations around program improvement and program changes. We've certainly found that there's incredible amount of hunger and appetite and interest from policymakers to answer these sorts of questions with a real sense of rigor and emphasis on rigor. Of course, focusing on program improvement and program changes isn't a substitute for understanding if underlying programs are effective, so not suggesting that, but I think there's been untapped potential to work with policymakers to answer questions about how can we improve programs, how can we address challenges that are associated with programs, how can we strengthen them, how can we increase their effectiveness and reach. And we've seen so much engagement when you work with policymakers focused on improving existing programs, strengthening them, addressing challenges, and doing that with a real degree of precision and rigor. And so I'm eager to bring this level of methodological rigor and emphasis on understanding impact to those kinds of questions where you can get both more engagement and you can answer questions in a more policy relevant time frame with a little bit more speed. So just excited to see that and appreciate the emphasis on the paper. And then lastly, I'll just mention that I'm interested to discuss and think about how we can share this menu in a broad way with policymakers. Another thing that we've learned over time is as policymakers have more exposure to diverse methods and tools and opportunities, they can be on the lookout for these sorts of opportunities for learning. Of course, every researcher wants to get a call from a policymaker to say, I'm about to run a large scale lottery. Is that of interest to you? That's the phone call everyone wants to get. Or we're about to redo our administrative data system for our education system in the state. Any interest in helping us think about fields and data linkage? That's the call that everyone wants to get. And I think the more that we think about ways to engage and share this with policymakers, it increases their opportunity to play a role, to identify places to plug in and to really kind of help drive this work. So would also love to think about, briefer perhaps and more accessible version for policymakers. That might be a next frontier in ways to really engage and share this with them so that they can also be part of identifying these opportunities for learning. So lots to discuss, but just kudos again. It was a fantastic read.
Thanks, Kayla. I think you're making some really good points. And just to underscore the point that you made about impact evaluation on program improvement and changes with rigor. It's rarely the case that a policymaker is facing the question of, is there impact? Yes, no, or we close the program or we open, it's not that kind of decision in reality. And so maybe with that, a good moment to ask Santosh to come in because you oversaw a very large program, a set of very large programs in India for many years, and really we're looking for those kinds of that kind of information to increase effectiveness. So maybe I'll turn to you now to reflect on what you've heard and how we might take this agenda forward.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Let me just start by congratulating CGD for putting together this panel today and for the excellent work that has come out of Sophie, your paper. My vantage point really is in taking on the point that Kelly made, is that waiting for that phone call. My point is that don't wait for that phone call. Make it the other way around. Policymakers today in many parts of the world are hungry for collaboration that will improve the impact of their programs. It is a daily struggle. It is a real struggle with deep consequences. Now, what I find exciting is that not only are each of the methods that we heard today interesting, it is sometimes the coming together of some of these methods that can really be very productive. And let me walk you through an example that I'm currently living with. And what I have done is that in the chat, I
think you put on your mute, Santosh. You put on mute. Okay, there you go. So you said chat was the last word that you said. So
yeah. So on the chat window, I've actually put a URL of a newspaper article written by a very senior Indian government functionary on what is called the aspirational district program. And I'm going to use this example to actually try in the 2 minutes I have left to demonstrate the real power of administrative data. Now, the aspirational district program covered 115 of India's poorest districts. And if you put their population together, it will be bigger than many countries, let me assure you. Took 49 indicators and 81 data points and tried to benchmark each district, and these are the poorest districts of India, and tried to benchmark them in a range of sectors such as health and nutrition, education, infrastructure, skills, so on and so forth. And then they ranked them on a delta basis month on month. What they found is that, and then they did something else, and that is that they then engaged an independent agency to go and independently measure some of these indicators. And therefore, in the first few years, what happened is that the administrative system was generating one data point, and the independent check was generating another data point for the same item of data. And literally what happened was it was a beauty contest. He said, my data is better than your data. And it was a very unproductive conversation. But what is the aspirational district program or the Niti Aayog doing today? It is leveraging the power of back checks and getting the independent agency to go into the granularity of the data that the administrative system was generating. And here again, what's exciting is the breakthrough in thinking we had was that normally when you do samples, you need a sample frame. You actually need the entire population on which you randomize. And in many of these administrative data points, for example, one of the oldest programs for nutrition and early child development is called in India ICDS, it's the Integrated Child Development Services. 1975 is when it started, 46 years ago. It seeks to weigh the child every month, and there is a growth chart maintained. There's early childhood development, there is even take-home rations for pregnant and lactating mothers. Now, the data on every child and her weight may not be available for a sample frame, but yet you can randomize, because on the center you can randomize. And then on that randomization, today using WhatsApp and other chat windows, you can actually ask your enumerator to take a photograph of the register in which the data that is available to you is not there. And then you can randomize on the 4th serial number in page 5. And like that, they have devised a very, what I would call a Jogad randomization system. Jogad is something which is low cost, informal. And using that, their aim is to build a data quality score for every district. And that data quality score is available to every district. And they're told that if your score falls below a certain level, then your data will not be accepted till your score goes up again. So the whole point is to incentivize the system itself by using independent back checks and quality scores. And I believe it's a very promising sort of line of work for people like us who are engaged in the data and the use of data for improving programmatic outcomes. The second thing that I want to talk about, and with this I will stop in just half a minute, is then to combine this data system with your remote sensing data. For example, night light luminosity or anonymized call data records, which actually are able to fairly effectively get you the delta on economic outcomes of small geographies. Now, if you take an aspirational district program, which is really trying to use a measure to map the progress that geography is making by harnessing administrative data and doing backchecks and data quality scores, and you then make it possible for people who are running the program to also then view how your nightlight luminosity or anonymized call data records are showing, then you have comparators that will give you a better sense of what's really happening on the ground. And I believe it is this combination of different methods which is the holy grail for us to be able to impact programmatic outcomes, which is really what we all seek to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Santosh, and for the very good example. And I've also tweeted the link that you shared in the chat for those of you following on YouTube. And I think, Santosh is a concrete example, and also great that there's a word for low cost and informal, because that is really, the way that we can make things work in the real world, because every country has really limited data sets and needs to triangulate in the way that you described to gain insight. Let me sort of drive you all now, bringing Ann-Sofie back into the conversation on some specific examples that you've seen using perhaps some of these methods or techniques and or new data sources in the context of COVID-19. I think it's amazing, the explosion of publication and things like that, but many of them have used observational studies. But the interesting thing is the new data sources. But can you give some examples of rapid evaluations that have informed policy action in response to COVID-19? Obviously, the time pressure was there. So maybe I could just invite any of you to give a couple of examples that you think are good ones. Ariel, I can tell that you want to say something. Would you like to come in first, or?
Sure. No, I'll happily. Yeah, I think the administrative data angle here was particularly powerful. I think exactly the explosion of the pandemic hit. We saw obviously case reporting data. Really pick up and the kind of quality assurance that Santosh was just describing in terms of independent reporting from universities and lots of institutes really kind of coalesced into a much more rigorous and kind of deeper data set on cases, which then let us tie all sorts of interventions to it. So I really like the Banerjee et al. Example that Ann-Sofie uses in the paper to consider a whole variety of interventions and messaging in India on linked to these kind of outcomes that are basically being generated by the public health system. And it's a really good example exactly of how this data at this scale with this kind of coverage and this kind of frequency can really allow you to test a whole variety of arms. One of the biggest challenges, of course, when you're testing multiple arms is, that you need a lot more outcome data and a lot larger samples, because every one of those arms has to have a reasonable sample associated with it to make sure you're measuring. And in these kind of cases where researchers or evaluators are looking at dozens, in some cases even hundreds of combinations, normally the sample sizes you need would just be way too large to commission any new data sets collected for it. But again, really powerful new administrative data let you harness those. So I'm particularly kind of appreciative that coalesced and came together and allowed this kind of research.
Yeah, Ann-Sofie, are there other examples that you would cite from your work?
Yeah, I mean, the first that came to mind is actually the study by Banerjee and colleagues. You say they reach a large sample, and it's like, yeah, I think it's 25 million people. So the coverage is good. That's an understatement. So that was interesting, I think, also. And the other directly COVID-related study that I bring up in the paper is a paper by Angrist and colleagues, where they evaluate education policy responses during the pandemic in Botswana. And this, I think, also is a nice example of one of these adaptive or iterative evaluations where they collect multiple rounds of data, and I think it was after like 4 to 6 weeks, they shared the first set of findings. They made some low tech intervention where they sent out text messages with the numeracy problems of the week, and they also had text messages coupled with tutor phone calls, and they looked at the different effect on student outcomes, and share their findings with a few weeks in between, so that policymakers could actually pick up on their findings and adapt policy accordingly. So that's an interesting example as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to say is, even household surveys seems to have been really on, what's the right word? They were driven much faster than we had seen in past rounds of field work. I'm thinking of the famous mask study from Bangladesh, where they're doing multiple rounds very often with a very, very high frequency. And I think that's something else to think about when we consider using it. It's really the policy urgency that has driven, in some ways, the innovation in timelines. And I think that's a really healthy thing. Maybe, Kelly, do you have some examples that you would share from the US or other work that you're familiar with?
Sure. It's we've taken on a lot of new work in the last year and a half in response to unexpected needs and changes. Obviously, no one had 4 years to plan for a series of evaluations on some of these pretty dramatic changes in the US in terms of how programs are provided, the size and scale of implementation, and the types of partnerships that have been launched. So we haven't done, our office hasn't done as much work in the public health space in the last year and a half, but have been trying to support agencies answer really interesting questions such as how do we equitably distribute resources in this context at speed and scale? And so one of the questions that we were asked to address and used a variety of methods to answer this question has been, of the various ways to distribute resources, first come, first serve, lottery, point systems, what's the implications on who receives them, both in the kind of short term as well as what does this mean for downstream impacts, which is a really interesting question to wrestle with and answer, and has been so important that we know more about this in the context of distributing enormous number of programs, grants, loans, and various resources. So this has had to lead to innovation and a variety of partnerships, such as working across different local government partners who are using different methods, doing retrospective evaluation and data matching, using available administrative data sources and public data sources, such as credit card transaction data, web scraping, public information to try to get a sense of outcomes, and also led to some innovative approaches that we frankly would not have tried otherwise. So for example, to answer the question about what's the impact on equitable distribution across different distribution methods for programs, one of the colleagues on our team came up with the idea of doing a simulation, taking a wide variety of data from local government data sources, and then running it under all different scenarios to see what happens and who receives resources under different scenarios. So I honestly am not sure that we would have come up with that in a world in which we're doing multi-year planning and saying what's the ideal way to answer these questions. But with these time constraints and resource constraints and speed and pressure, it has led us to take on new methods, to think creatively, to come up with a kind of new and different ways to answer questions that agencies are asking and wrestling with. So I'm hope that this innovation and creativity and interdisciplinary collaboration and emphasis on creative data sources continues moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, well, also thinking about vaccine distribution, which is sort of the ultimate in equitable distribution problems. And it's interesting that it's only the lottery people who wanted to compare to status quo sort of did testing. And there's just so much more that needs to be done there and to be done rigorously, because there are obviously costs associated with different strategies, and there's a differing effectiveness, even more important in terms of getting uptake. So I hope that we'll see more of that coming out of all parts of the world, and some financing to be able to answer that really important question. Going back to you, Santosh, you already gave us a really good example. Do you have some others in mind that you would want to share in terms of the COVID-19 response?
Yeah, I do. This really is from Indian state of Bihar, and two things that happened. One is some work that Assistant Professor Sharan from the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of Maryland, College Park did. He, by the way, was a postdoctoral fellow at CGD as well. He did he did some work for the Chief Minister's office, where he actually took publicly available electoral rolls from panchayat elections, which fortunately had a large number of mobile phone numbers of candidates. So people who stood for elections, won and lost. And and it's a very large sample. He actually used extremely cheap outbound phone calls to these people, waves after waves, and he was able to get a sense for the Chief Minister's office as to what really was the incidence of COVID, how lives and livelihoods were being disrupted. And that was enormously useful for policymakers during that period. The second is the controversy that broke out in Bihar and in some other states on COVID testing and the inflation in numbers. Again, it's outbound mobile phone calls that really help to settle the debate, and to therefore the possibility of using extremely cheap methods, especially where mobile telephony is ubiquitous. There are lots of new ways in which both policy and our scholarship can actually be improved. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I had a list of questions, but I'm going to go immediately to the last one, just because I think Many of the examples that you're giving are speaking to the importance of administrative data and to data infrastructure in countries. And I mean, one great thing that Ann-Sofie does in her papers also talks about the limitations of those kinds of data, the cleaning that has to go on, the cross checks that one has to do. Santosh just talked a little bit about that. But what kinds of investments would we want to see from governments and external funders into this data infrastructure, which serves multiple purposes? It serves obviously the effort to assess the net impact of programs or changes into those programs, but it also serves just general monitoring and management purposes. I would say I was just looking at the World Bank's World Development Report 2021, and they talk about an integrated national data system, et cetera. But we don't see the kinds of big investments in data or scale happening so often. It's all usually done on a sector by sector basis. So what would you advise governments in terms of how to invest in this? And then external funders, what role might they have in all of this? And maybe I'll go back to you, Santosh, since you are perhaps closest to some of these discussions, or you prefer not?
Amanda, I want to answer that question slightly differently. I don't want to pontificate on directly, but there's something that I want to say here in this context. See, in my years of work with academics, I find a deep-seated problem, and that is the incentive set that they are confronted with. Now, just look at the case of Sharan. I worked with Sharan for almost 10 years, from the time he was a young student to he was a PhD scholar at Harvard. And I understand the kind of passion young academics bring to the field. But then if they have to go forward in their academic career, it's all about publication. Now, if we do not set up an incentive structure for some of the best minds in our world to also engage with policy and the real lives of people. I'm not saying that academia and publication is not important, but there has to be a more wider or a broader set of incentives so that people can really diversify and do that. And as far as governments making investments are concerned, and I used to be in the finance department of a government, right? And I used to find it extremely difficult to justify as to why my state government needed to make these investments, because they are too expensive, the results come out too late, they're not practical. So that finding that combination, that sweet spot between timeliness and academic rigor, the kind of work JPAL, for example, does now, or the kind of work ID Insight does now, which is actually at the intersection of policy and academia. How do we find spaces for entities like this to grow and prosper is really, I think, the challenge of our times.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the ideas that we've been talking about in the working group is really to try and show the return on investment, either through savings or expanded impact, by taking a look at using these methods to understand what's happening and to correct and adjust programs. But as you say, it's not just a paper published, it's about using the information to adjust practice in order to enhance outcomes and to stay engaged over really multiple years to understand programs and policies and how they're working. Others on thoughts on the data infrastructure? Kelly, you're sitting in an entity that looks across all of the different agencies and departments of the US government. How do you think about that agenda? It's a little bit different from your daily bread and butter, I would guess, but how does it intersect with the data infrastructure piece?
Sure, and yeah, I definitely can't advise donors in my government capacity, so I'll politely not answer that question, but tackle some related ones. So I guess one thing I'll just mention that I'm excited about as a potential pilot underway in real time as the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act is being implemented in the government is the movement right now for federal agencies and policymakers to publicly share their highest priority research and evaluation questions, and to make sure that those are very directly connected with strategic management priorities of agencies. It's too soon to say how this will work and how this will play out. Those will be posted by all federal agencies publicly in February for those who are tracking this. But I think it's a really exciting opportunity to harness external interest. For years, we've all been talking about this disconnect between hunger for evidence and support and collaboration from policymakers, hunger from external groups to do policy relevant research, and we haven't sufficiently figured out how to bridge that gap. And I think it'll be really interesting to see in the coming years what happens when we put forward a public research agenda. How does that change the way that we work together? How does that spur new work? How does that spur new investment? And what comes of it? Hopefully some of the questions agencies put forward, academics will say, it's been asked and answered. Here you go. You actually don't need to commission lots of new work. And of course, other ones are going to be novel and thorny and hopefully lead to new collaborations. So I'm really excited to see how that changes the way that we work together, how that changes data investments, and hopefully identifies in particular some real unifying opportunities for investment and integration of data across agencies when we all realize we have the same questions or overlapping questions and are wrestling with similar issues. A part of the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act is also to encourage agencies to put forward data catalogs and share data as much as possible. That is a big undertaking, and I really hope that changes and shifts the way that we work together moving forward as a broader community. That's new and novel, just to share all of the data you have, not even to put it all publicly, but just to share the catalog of all of the data that's collected through all of your administrative activities and surveys. Just that in and of itself should and could transform the way that we think about research moving forward, so that external folks aren't guessing or hoping and thinking up, different indicators or fields, but really basing that on what's already available. I hope and think that could have a transformative effect of the way that policymakers engage with research and the way that we work together, and hopefully create some efficiencies moving forward as we have a better and more comprehensive sense of the data that's already exists, so that we can identify key gaps, key needs, what's missing, but also just take advantage of the rich data that's in place. So that was my attempt to pivot to answer the donor funding question and try to answer something related. So I'll let others answer your direct question.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think having these different data sets speak to each other, of course, it's helped by having some kind of unique ID, which India does have, but using sort of the geolocation data is a kind of fix to that. And maybe Ariel, I'll ask you to think about that or reflect on that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great segue. A lot of the work that Ann-Sofie's highlighted that's now possible really is thanks to the precision of the georeferencing or even the unique IDs that we have in administrative data. And the power really is that it lets us, again, as Ann-Sofie highlighted, make comparisons that we believe in more, like compare individuals who are much more similar or geographic units that are much more similar than we previously could when we only knew, say, the district or the state in which they lived. And so we were only making comparisons across these very kind of coarse geographic units or individual units. And so that power is really in the specificity and the precision. And as you described, Amanda, a lot of what we're after now is linking data sets from different sectors or from different disciplines and doing that at these really fine scales. And that can be tricky and thorny too for a variety of reasons. And I think donors helping both the academics think through how to properly link these data at these levels, but then also making sure that we can, and in administrative data, doing so in a way that protects the confidentiality of the individuals, but still allows for the research uses. Those would also be super powerful investments. I think on the government side, rather than only thinking about this, a big challenge that we constantly face when we're considering kind of geospatial impact evaluations is that the constraint really is on the specificity of the data on where the interventions took place and when they took place and who was targeted by them. And that frequently we have plenty of data to be able to link to it in terms of outcomes. But for a government agency or a donor or a recipient country partner to really hone in on where exactly was this village where these interventions went or this programming affected? And why did you choose these set of villages as opposed to these other set of villages? That's perennially the constraint. Often we have to do months and months of digging to get there, right? It's typically sitting on a hard drive in the office of such and such person. Maybe they don't even know they had it because the engineers, when they were building the rural roads, the engineers submitted the AutoCAD drawings, and we have to go back and dig those out. But they exist, and governments really could be spending a lot more time just trying to pull those out into the daylight and being able to share those. That would solve a huge amount of constraints.
Well, of course, I'm sure there's some politics there with some of those kinds of decisions that are made at the beginning of programs, but I think you're signaling something important, which is, part of it's not, we have other complementary data sets, but it's actually the program documentation. What was the intervention and where was it provided, who received it is really, really crucial. And I mean, sometimes when you look at the interventions themselves are not standardized. It's a very different intervention in different places, and being able to document that well, which is well within the scope of what a normal program management effort would be, is really needed. Ann-Sofie, you looked at some of these issues. What would you have a set of recommendations to external funders? Maybe you could sort of give us a little overview of that.
Just to first kind of second what Ariel was talking about a bit, because a kind of a concrete example that comes to mind is actually, geocoding the aid data, where the organization aid data has made a huge contribution, but there's still, the data is still far from complete. I guess we're talking about, geocoding the kind of the backlog of old projects. You have to do a lot of digging, as Ariel describes it here. But if you think from now and going forward, it should be very easy, right? Just routinely report the locations within the aid project, and that would help to kind of get a more complete picture of who is reached by the different projects and what the coverage is within countries and so on from different donors. Because now I think it's mainly, Ariel, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the World Bank, and then it's a bunch of partner countries that themselves kind of geocoding coming aid flows and so on. So it's this public good dimension that is a bit problematic here as well. Who should finance this, and where is the ultimate responsibility? Is it the reporting systems in the partner country, or is it the funders, the donors involved in these projects and so on? So here I think external funding could absolutely have an important role by strengthening local statistical offices and help them in this process. And organizations like aid data could also are of course also extremely important to kind of coordinate this process and make the data comparable, so that different countries do not use different reporting systems and so on. So yeah, build capacity in the aid receiving countries in their statistical offices should be really important, and also have some kind of coordinating organization to kind of steer everyone in the same direction, so to speak. Yeah, that's maybe a bit off topic from the recommendations in the paper, but I just was inspired by Ariel's.
Although, yeah, I mean, I think it points that there are some public goods in this infrastructure that are not very well funded, that would serve across different areas. I want to switch to, we've had a couple of questions come in, so I'm just going to, well, one of them has to do with, the background paper is really focusing on evidence generation, so data methods to assess net impact. However, evidence synthesis is also a big deal in the field and of great interest when you look at, you want to learn from other countries and other settings. what is the role of evidence synthesis? Are there innovations in that space that we need to think about, platforms and tools for synthesis that would be more useful for policymakers than the offer that exists now? There are some modest efforts to do these kinds of evidence syntheses. There's also lots of methodological and disciplinary differences on whether you can aggregate policy or programmatic interventions across settings in the way that one would do, for example, if one was looking at a clinical trial for a medicine or something like that. Any thoughts on that as we think about getting this kind of evidence more in use? Maybe Ariel has thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the explosion of these new data sources, it really helps us in a lot of ways because the data sources are in some ways standardized. I mean, the satellites are capturing imagery that's, in theory similar. Of course, the context and the application of it are quite different, but a lot of the underlying pieces are there for us to be doing much more synthesis work now. And also the samples are much larger. So, when we're talking about especially remote sense data, but increasingly the standardized survey data, the DHSs, the living standards measurement surveys, et cetera, that are much more standardized these days. That gives us much more scope to do that. I mean, the programmatic comparability challenge and the kind of contextual, the varying effects in different places challenges, those are baked in, but at least on the measurement side, we have some of the building blocks much more at the ready to be doing a lot more of this. And it would be really refreshing to see more of this done, again, at a cross-country scale. Yeah.
Santosh or Kelly, do you have thoughts on this issue of evidence synthesis?
Go ahead, Santosh.
No, up to you, Kelly, up to you.
I was just gonna, to the earlier point about kind of public facing learning agendas, just to say that I think this is going to, in the next couple of years, yield to a lot of range of pilots of different types and of levels of evidence synthesis for different types of questions. So I think there's going to be some that are big thorny questions that many agencies are wrestling with, where we're going to figure out what is the ability, as you said, to aggregate and compare different types of programs across different policy areas, disciplines. What are the limitations, of course? And then there's going to be some really deep, specific technical synthesis for very agency, population, program, time specific questions. And I think it's just going to be exciting to see a wide range of models, hopefully in the public sphere, that will come out in the next couple of years. I think it should be a pretty significant, hopefully 1,000% increase of evidence synthesis that are informing federal programs in the next couple of years. And so just to, more say, let's watch this space and see where we are in a couple of years, see which types, models, level of collaboration, independence versus non-independence yields to the most utilization and change. I think it's going to be interesting to see how we use information that was developed externally versus synthesis that were developed in close coordination with leadership. And I think it'll be a really interesting opportunity to watch a number, probably 30 to 40 different pilots in the next couple of years and see which really yielding to informed policy based on those.
Great, thank you, Kelly. We'll bring you back to tell us what you find. Santosh, do you have thoughts on this issue? You're on mute.
Just to add to what Kelly was saying, that the need for evidence synthesis and perhaps a class of people who specialize in actually spotting opportunities and making available the world of scholarship in a way that is digestible, readily available, to hold hands, to engage in a longer partnership, so that much of these learnings are available and useful as policy gets made, it gets implemented, and that insight. So maybe we should look at a class of professionals who are actually not the people who do research, for the people who sit between the consumers of this and the producers of this. I'm not sure if that's something which we have thought about, but there is a lot of, and typically when I was in government, how I benefited was from the generosity of scholars who had funding for scholarship, and at the tail end had something for, there are a large number of researchers working with them, making available their kind services for a year at a point, a year, 2 years at a time. And much of the impact that I was able to do when I was in government with policy was because of the generosity of people like Abhijit or Esther, who actually made available these people to me. And I was just plain lucky. But we need to, as funders and to be generous in being able to make these resources available. And they are not expensive. It's just a question of a few people. And typically these are people who are between a master's and a PhD, who really want to spend 2 to 3 years, understanding the field, preparing themselves, and they're ideally suited. And by doing so, you're also encouraging people without the means to be actually able to engage in deep scholarship 3 years, 4 years from now. So, and I think it's a lot of positive externalities from that kind of investment. Thank you.
Maybe, Amanda, can I piggyback on that just to emphasize, I think, a point that Ann-Sofie had about interdisciplinary partnerships and ranges of collaborations and partnerships. Agree fully, Santosh, in particular, on that last point about opportunities to bring a wide variety of scholars into this process and thinking. Our office operates a fellowship program, and Uplug will be announcing our next round of applications for fellows shortly, where we bring in both more junior academics as well as senior academics who have a wide variety of backgrounds from social and behavioral sciences and evaluation methods, and try to match them with agency challenges and questions to design and implement impact evaluations. And I just, again, emphasize, I think, the opportunity here for both interdisciplinary teams, which Ann-Sofie mentioned, the opportunity and ability to create innovative designs and solutions to bring kind of both broad literature to bear as we're thinking about evaluation designs and evidence synthesis, but also that challenges and improves us in a wide variety of ways. Having an interdisciplinary team of folks that also have, as you said, data scientists and designers really does strengthen, from our perspective, the work that we're producing and our analysis and understanding of implications and future work as well. I think that also aligns with evidence synthesis work. And we've also just seen the incredible opportunity to work with scholars and academics at a wide variety of professional places and points in their career. I think the opportunity to bring more junior scholars into applied policy environments and help them create a future trajectory of work that's directly linked with policy relevant questions is kind of an unmet potential where there's real appetite and hunger to do that. So just wanted to emphasize and agree with you, Santosh, on that last point. I think it's a really exciting piece that Ann-Sofie referenced in her paper that wanted to make sure that got emphasized as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really practical idea. I hope, Kelly, you'll drop the link to your fellowships posting when it's ready on our feed, and we'll be happy to spread the word further. I'm going to read 2 questions from the audience, and then I'll just do a final round with each of you as we're nearing the kind of 8-minute mark. So one question, and they are not totally related, some of them are, is that adaptive and iterative evaluations and multiple treatment arm studies require very sophisticated implementation and very close partnership between implementers and researchers. So they're often hard to commit to or not feasible. So the question is, how can we equip implementers, funders, and clients to embrace these more capacity intensive approaches? And I think what you were just mentioning, Kelly, is part of the answer, which is that this is just the way that we run our program, or this is just the way we run policy. But I'll do a round on that. The second question, somewhat related, what are the opportunities to use early outcome data for intervention improvements early on in implementation? For example, knowledge or adoption data that are available before final outcomes. So that's another kind of specific intervention opportunity. If we think about these kinds of new data and impact evaluation as a development intervention itself, what are the moments that we could come in where change is really possible? And that early phase is probably a very good one. So let's start with you, Ann-Sofie. Do you have thoughts on these questions that have been posed? And final words. You're on mute.
You didn't miss anything. I'm just saying that I'm not sure I have a good answer for how to best get people on board for the adaptive and iterative evaluations, except for what we've already discussed in terms of collaboration between academics and between policymakers and interdisciplinary collaborations as well. And just one point that that all of the panelists mentioned that I think that I didn't bring up explicitly in the paper, but that I probably should have, is the use of mixed methods and being able to combine different approaches as well. So it doesn't have to be, that's something that everyone, both Ariel and Kelly and Shantos brought up. So that is something that, depending on constraints, again, if the constraints are that you don't have the capacity, maybe that's something to think about if you adapt to the constraints of the implementer again. So yeah. About the second question, sorry, you would have to repeat that question. So maybe take someone in between.
It was sort of the early use of that kind of adaptive iterative evaluation before outcomes are on the table to be evaluated. Obviously, the same methods would apply to looking at adoption, enrollment, et cetera. So that was sort of another question on how to facilitate that.
There is some discussion about using more proximate outcomes in the paper, the so-called surrogate indices. I don't know if that's what they're after, but that's, I hope I remember correctly, but it's ATSI working on these things a lot. So there's some material about that in the paper, but yeah, there are some interesting studies using these approaches as well. So it seems like a promising avenue going forward. Yeah.
Okay, great. Ariel?
Yeah, maybe I'll take them in reverse order. On this kind of issue of proximate outcomes or early signals, one thing I found is that often a lot of those data are available in administrative or programmatic data for the treatment groups. And if you're doing A/B testing or kind of just multiple treatment arms, that might be sufficient. And it's really essential to make sure those are reliable and collected, and available to the researchers to analyze quickly. Often we kind of get this kind of lag where we know the implementing partners are asking people about their impressions and knowledge at the end of a training, but the researchers don't get that till months or years later. And then of course, if you've got a comparison or control group, collecting comparable data for that group as well, sometimes the missing piece to be able to get these signals early. There's also, increasingly, the big data that Ann-Sofie mentioned, whether it's remote sensing or cell phone data that is available to capture some of these kind of early behaviors, especially if they're, observable from space in a farm or quick text-based responses that people can provide on key knowledge questions or enrollment. Those are increasingly available to us. I think on the the other question in terms of the kind of say like broader take-up issues, this is a perennial challenge. I think it's really like at the intersection of, again, these kind of multidisciplinary fields and getting collaboration across them. Getting the incentives right is really essential. And what we found really is that because we're wanting, there's always going to be a trade-off. I wouldn't be an economist if I didn't tell you that again and again. But we're trying to do this stuff earlier and quicker. And there's going to be a trade-off, and the complexity is going to be packed into the beginning, much more so. Keep in mind, you'd be spending all that capacity and more over a 6-year window if you did like a super long and expensive RCT. So, you're trying to pack a lot of it in quicker, and I think that's part and parcel of it. I would say, especially for these early, rapid results, multiple methods are essential. And so you're going to want multiple disciplines that's going to combine those things to get you much more reliable answers. It's going to be complex, but, again, I think that's part of the price we pay for wanting these answers quicker.
I just think kind of normalizing it as part of program design and initial scaling up is part of it, sort of adjusting the thinking. I'll ask Kelly and Santosh for their final comments, and let me also interject a last question. I mean, in some ways, we commissioned this overview of sort of new developments in methods, new developments in data to show that some of the straw man objections to bringing rigorous evidence to policymaking were not really a thing. I think the field has found ways to be relevant and to be inserted and adding value into programs and policies. But maybe I'll ask you also to reflect on that point. It's not the old style, it's a small NGO, it's a 6-year study, it's expensive. It's really not that anymore. It's a different world. And that different world has been going on in the private sector for a long time. And in the public sector, we're sort of still getting on board. But so maybe I'll ask Santosh and Kelly for your final inspirational comments related to that as well. Thanks. Santosh.
Oh, good. Okay, so I think the motivation behind the question of early data and its use is, I'll try to speak to that motivation because I've been on the other side. The thing is that the relationship between a policymaker and people like you and me who are in the field of research and data is instrumental. Let's be very clear about it. There's no romance here. I mean, you will be as useful as you are useful. And one way to look at and to identify opportunities, which I have found extremely effective, is to actually look at political rhetoric. We dismiss that as all sorts of noise, but in political rhetoric, I have found the seeds of where the real interest can possibly lie. I'm not saying that you'll get a one-on-one shot at 100% success, but that's always, in my own sort of professional experience, I found it to be extremely useful. And to use what you have to actually shape that in a way that speaks to that political rhetoric, and then you will find that your doors will open, whether it is early results or is midterm results or final results. You have something useful, it'll get sold.
Excellent. I think that's the right place to end this. And I think please do follow and be engaged with all of our panelists and speakers today, and watch our Center for Global Development site for more work related to these issues. As I mentioned, we're sort of working on the final recommendations of the working group, and we'll put out a set of materials on that, really linking to the entire field, because this is not this is not something that actually needs to be created. We're really just recording what's happening organically in the field, and that is that this set of methods and data is evolving in real time to be able to provide better answers. And as Santosh points out, speak to the priorities of the politicians and policymakers. That's the not so secret. So thanks to all of our panelists and to Ann-Sofie for a great paper, and we'll look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.